My name's Jackie Jacob. I'm the coordinator for the Small and Backyard Flocks Community of Practice on E-Extension. And as such, I do the monthly webinars. And we have an interesting one this month. We're going to be looking at poultry production over the decades. Dr. Michael Darre from University of Connecticut, or soon to be retired, has over 30 years of poultry extension, and he will be discussing his impressions on how poultry production has changed over the years and what hasn't changed. Give us a overview of how poultry has changed or not changed over the decades. He doesn't have a PowerPoint presentation and he doesn't have a video, so all you're going to see is his name up there, but he is there. You'll hear him talking. I will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat box, so if you have any questions, put them in, and if it's appropriate with what he's talking about, I will interrupt him to get a clarification on a question. Otherwise, we'll wait and hold the questions to the end. All yours, Mike.
Very good. Thank you, Jackie, and thanks everybody for coming to the meeting. I know this is a middle of the week, Wednesday at 3:30 in the afternoon for most of us. Probably not the ideal time to take off to do this, but I appreciate you being here. So as Jackie said, I've got over 37 and a half years here in the University of Connecticut, and then another 6 years at University of Illinois. While I was doing my master's and PhD work, I was working in the industry there, so I've seen a lot of changes over the period of time. I'm sorry I don't have any good pictures or things to show. I'm in the process of moving and cleaning out my office and everything else, so everything's in a jumble here. But I do have my scrambled brain to work from and talk from. So, and many of you probably seen and know about some of these changes already, but I kind of want to do this over the three different major categories of poultry that we deal with commercially. There's probably a fourth if you look at waterfowl. They're not as big, but the three main areas I want to focus on today and talk about will be: one, the layer industry, two, the broiler industry, and then three, the turkey industry. So Jackie said, so what has not changed? What has not changed is the fact that people eat chicken and people eat eggs and people have Thanksgiving dinner and mostly use turkeys. So that's probably the few things that haven't changed. Now, what has changed? So let me go into the layer industry from my point of view first. Way back when I started out when I was a kid, back in the 1950s, the commercial industry wasn't as big as it is today. It wasn't as developed today. And there were still a lot of what you call small flock or a lot of farm flocks. And at that point, from the early 1900s and probably before that up until the mid-1950s to 1960, a lot of farms supplemented their income with their egg money. And I know my great aunts and great uncles and stuff on the farms in Illinois and Wisconsin, they had their small flocks, well, you can say small, 500 to 1,000 birds for layers. And at that time, it was considered women's work. So it was the wife or the girls in the family and the young children, at which point I was, that went out and took care of the chickens and collected the eggs and got attacked by the roosters that were protecting the hens. So, and that was all floor operations with some nest boxes and some roost material, and a lot of the chickens were, quote, free range back then. So a lot of mortality. We were feeding the wildlife back then. It was typical of what's happening today as we change. It's funny when I look back and I say, this is what we did 50, 60 years ago, and now people want to go back to do the same thing that we did 60 years ago instead of seeing the improvements we made. They think it was better to go back then. But I can tell you back then, mortality was high, a lot of broken eggs, a lot of dirty eggs. Egg production per hen or hen day production was really relatively low compared to today. They didn't have a really good commercial feed as well. They had some commercial feeds, but let's put it this way, the poultry nutritionists didn't have a sound feeling for it at the time. They were doing a lot of mixing, farm mixing, and different rations at the time in the late 40s, early 50s. That's when they really started getting more into really good developed commercial rations for the layer industry, which improved egg production. But I was just looking back and saw some ads from the late 1920s up to the 1940s, where they were showing lone girl, raises 5,000 hens in her garage in new cage system. And they were extolling the attributes of the cage system and how wonderful it was. You could put so many birds in one place and you get good clean eggs because they roll out of the cage, and you could look at every bird. You didn't have to walk through the flock. So it was funny. And now if you look at the way the welfare things are going today, everything's anti-cage, go back to the floor, go back to the flock. So, I guess if you wait long enough, everything comes around. So if you have some old bell-bottom pants from the 60s, hang on to them. I'm sure in another 20 years, it'll be the new fashion trend. But anyway, so what happened then in the late 50s and early 60s, the cage systems are starting to catch on, especially out in California, where they had open air barns, shall we say. They had roof over the head. They had rollout canvas sides as needed for weather control, but mostly they're open-sided and single deck. They weren't stacked deck cage systems, or if anything, it was two-deck cage systems. That was it, more like a pyramid style. And they had some really huge poultry farms out in California. They call them ranches, where they had egg layers and cages, and that was like a novel thing, and everyone was extolling the virtues of it. And the fact that egg production went up per hen, mortality went down per hen, and feed to product ratios were getting much, much better because it was controlled. They weren't running around as much. Parasitism went way down, so internal parasites, especially worms, lice, mites, ticks, all these ectoparasites, we saw a decrease in that when they went to the cage systems. So it was really a positive change, and then pretty soon it caught on. And I know here in Connecticut, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s or so, there were over 4,000 poultry farms, not all full-time, but there are about 4,000 different poultry farms here in Connecticut. And Connecticut and New England was one of the leaders in the poultry industry. New England had a lot of leadership role in developing changes for the poultry industry that we see kind of somewhat implemented today because of what they pioneered out here. One of the things that they did was the Connecticut Poultry House. They had a single, two-story, three-story, and four-story buildings based on the Ag Engineering Department here at University of Connecticut had developed some good plans for these. Now, these are floor operations, and that's why there are so many of these, like 4,000 farms. Some of these farms only had 1,000 birds. Some had up to 5,000 or 6,000, and that was considered a big flock, considering it was all floor operations. As the cage systems started to be developed, companies like Short Time were developing different cage systems, and as they came in, there was an expense. So some of the farmers had to consider, do I want to put the expense out to put the new cages in, which means I had to modify my building or put a new building up for the cage systems and change ventilation and lighting and everything else. Some of the farms dropped out, so they started decreasing. That number, slowly went down year by year by year until by the 1980s, there were maybe 150 farms that were still active that I say semi-commercial here in Connecticut. And if you look at today, there's really only one major layer operation, and there's several smaller ones up to 5,000 birds. And then, of course, thousands of backyard flocks out there now. So we've seen what happened in the layer industry early on when the cages were introduced. We had some consolidation occurring because now we could get more birds in a single place. The eggs they could produce at a better cost compared to those on the floor operation, which means those that were not willing to change, they kind of got out of the business. They couldn't afford to stay in because their cost of production was much higher than those at the cost of production for the cage systems. So that was a major change. Now, back then, the type of housing they had for the layers was pretty interesting, because you had either what they called the shallow pit systems, okay, and multi-tier, maybe 3 or 4 tiers in a pyramid shape with backer boards so that the birds didn't drop manure on each other, and drop down into a shallow pit, which then had a chain and a scraper system to pull the manure out on a fairly regular basis. Or what many of the buildings up in New England Northeast area was, and other parts of the country, they had what they call the deep pit or high-rise house. And those were like a 2-story building where the second stories where the birds were in cages above, and then underneath the cages was open down to the basement or into a pit. And so manure would pile up, and you would get sometimes 3 or 4 up to 5 feet piles of manure underneath over, a year's time. And then they clean them out once a year when they renewed the flock, and did that. So one of the problems they saw in the industry at that time with high-rise houses was we had some fly problems. Some of you probably remember that. We're in the industry, you know that we had a lot of flies in the manure pits and trying to get rid of them with something. So one of the things they came up with was a compound called cyrolazine, which could be fed through the chickens that would then get into the manure, which would then kill the larvae. And at that time, then they renamed it Larvadex. And that was a pretty good thing. And then people felt, well, maybe feeding extra chemicals to laying hens wasn't the best thing to do. So that kind of went out of disfavor after a while. But when I first came here in January of 1981, there were still some of the high-rise houses. They had swine. They had big pigs running around in the manure pits, eating whatever eggs that dropped down, the feed that dropped down, and nosing through the manure to eat the fly larvae. So that reduced the fly population. That was a great solution for a while. But then food safety people came in and said, well, you can't have pigs down there eating through manure in the pit, even though it was keeping flies down, and the pigs were getting big fat. They also had extra feed. They didn't just feed the pigs manure and whatever dropped down and dead birds that came through. They also had a regular ration up there to help them. Eating the raw eggs, they had to supplement the pigs with some biotin because of the avidin in the eggs, which was an antibiotin factor. So that was pretty interesting. But then the health people came in and said, now we can't have pigs down there running around, so they stopped that practice. Then they decided, well, maybe if we windrow down there, get some windrowers. So some companies came out with these windrow machines to windrow the manure pits in these high-rise and deep pit houses. And that was a good deal. And then the cage companies came up with an idea that said, well, why don't we put manure belts in between each row of cages and stack the cages straight up and down in a stacked deck instead of the pyramid. That way you can get one more row of cages in a house of the same width, and you can go as high as you want. So one of the changes again was going from maybe a 4-deck or 5-deck system up to some of these are now 12 decks high. So every four levels, there'd be a catwalk. So these are huge houses that could house over 300,000 birds in a single building. When some of the original buildings way back in the 50s and 60s, like I say, if you had 60, 70,000 birds, it was big. Then it went to 100,000 birds and went to 150 and growing bigger and bigger. And now the trend is to go just the opposite direction. Now the trend is to go to cage-free or the new aviary systems for layers. I'm not sure how well that's working out. I understand we're seeing more breast problems, more egg breakage. Some of the buildings, they're using litter in between rows instead of a clean floor and scraping. So there may be a little more dust. They're seeing leg problems and keel damage. A couple of reasons. When the birds are jumping up and down from their aviary open cage, if you want to call it, down to the floor, chickens don't have really good 3D vision. So when they jump down, they kind of land on other birds, or they miss and maybe hit something on the floor or a cage, or the cage bar that's out in front of the cage bar, the perch area. They may hit that coming down. So we're seeing lots of problems that weren't really well thought out for these aviary systems. But again, from the animal welfare standpoint, most people feel that that's going to be the better system. That's still out to the jury to find out. So the layer industry has definitely consolidated. It has changed in the way the birds are being reared. The newer systems, like I say, those that are keeping cage type systems, now they went from what we call a standard cage that was deeper than wide. Years ago, they switched that to what we call the shallow cage, which is a wide but not so deep. So pretty much all the birds could feed at the same time, be at the front. They also changed the configuration of the wire on the front. So the wire used to be what you'd say is horizontal or vertical. So the wire in the front of the cage was vertical, like bars to a prison. So the bird stuck their head out to feed, and if another bird came alongside and nudged it sideways, the bird would get his head stuck in the wire. So then the cage manufacturers realized that was a problem, so they started making horizontal fronts to the cages so the birds could move their heads sliding back and forth on the cage. If they got nudged, they can move sideways without getting their head caught. So that was a welfare improvement. So that's some good ideas there. And then I can't remember how many years ago, we got away from pretty much the open cup watering systems, and pretty much all the nipple watering systems came in to play in cage layer houses, some form of a nipple system. And that is really a vast improvement for the birds. One of the reasons why physiologically is we know that chickens don't have the ability to create vacuum in their mouth because they have a cleft palate or slit palate that goes right to their nose area, their nasal area. So they can't create a vacuum in their mouth and suck things up. So when they drink out of a cup or other drinker that's low, they have to put their head up and get the water to shift back to their throat and get it down their esophagus. However, with the nipple system, their head's already up. The water can drip down. The birds actually drink more water. So some of the studies I've seen show a 15 to 20% increase in water consumption with birds using nipples. Now, when the nipple systems first came out, they weren't perfected. They did leak a little bit. Some people complained about the water dripping and stuff. But I think the modern nipple systems they have now are really good. They don't leak much. Birds get much more water, and it's clean because it's not an open system. They're not getting dust and dirt and manure and stuff into the systems. So that was interesting. So that came along. Then the next big change probably came because of Proposition 2 out in California when they pretty much wanted to ban cages because the birds couldn't stand up, turn around, spread their wings, and all that. So they came up with the idea of what's called a colony cage. So the colony cages could be anywhere from 15 to 60 birds in one big cage system. And they had to increase the floor space per bird. It went from way back when to about 48 square inches per bird. And now it's anywhere from 72 to 144 square inches per bird, depending on the system that they're in. And a lot of this came about because of the animal rights, animal welfare movement. The United Egg Producers back in 1999 and 2000, they formed a scientific advisory committee to come up with some welfare guidelines for the egg industry. And they wanted to, set up what are the space requirements for the different types of birds, whether they're brown egg layers or white egg layers. What about watering systems, feeding systems, lighting, ammonia levels? So a lot of these things were kind of open to whatever the whims were of the producer were prior to that. And for those that wanted to be in the UEP program, they pretty much needed to follow the guidelines. And so it improved the welfare, increased space for the bird, and by doing that, it also increased egg production per bird. So hen day production went up on those birds. So those are some things that went along. So along with the guidelines, okay, and the Proposition 2, those colony cages came in. Some of the issues with colony cages are similar to the issues you have on floor operations. Birds are social animals, and since they're highly social, they like to set up their pecking order or social order. And they can't remember 60 different birds. So they can remember 15 to 20 maybe and do well with that. So they really have a lot of intermixing that still goes on. There's still some cannibalism, feather pecking, fighting, vent pecking that goes on in these colony cages that you didn't see that much of in the smaller cages when you had 6 to 9 birds in the cage at somewhere between 65 and 72 square inches per bird. So those are some of the changes, that were dictated outside, shall we say, from consumer driven or from the public driven for welfare purposes, but they actually benefit, I think, the birds physiologically, and we get better production because they're not overcrowded. And the cage makers and the allied industry is working along with the industry to find much better ways to house chickens, the layer hens, as we go through. So kind of a quick overview to where we are today. Like I say, now we have several different systems still out there. We have some traditional cages that are being phased out. Some are going into modified colony cages, and some are going into what they call enriched colony cages. Some are going into aviaries totally inside. Some are going to aviaries at outside access through pop holes. Some are going to semi-outside access, what they call a winter porch type system. So there's a lot of variations out there. And that's not even talking about organic production. So on the organic side, I know that the organic rules are still up for debate and what's going on there. They're still discussing some of those, but outside access for organic means outside on the ground, not outside on a porch that should be raised up on a second level or whatever. So I know there's some larger organic layer operations that have 2-story buildings, and if the organic law rules pass that they have to be on outside on the dirt or on the ground for access, that's going to change that a little bit and probably increase the price of organic eggs again. So that's kind of some of the changes I've seen from the producer side. From the genetic side, it's phenomenal. And of course, it's probably shrinking numbers of different breeders out there a little bit. Fortunately, North Carolina State is still running their layer contest, if you want to call it that, or the layer test. Ken Anderson, Dr. Anderson's been doing a great job running that. And in recent years, they've added all these new cage systems. They've added organic, they've added aviary, they've added free range, all these different ways to test to see how the different strains of birds do under these different conditions. And now we're seeing some of the different breeding companies, again, are rethinking their breeding and genetic selection for birds that are more suited for the aviary system, more suited for free range like they used to be 50, 60 years ago, and more suited for other types of management systems. So you can pretty much pick and choose a genetic strain today based on which system you're doing, what color egg you need to have, and what kind of production level you can expect to get from those different genetic strains. One of the things they're still working on is reducing the cannibalistic instinct or feather pecking instinct in the chickens. So in colony cages, free range aviary systems, we can get birds that are adapted to that also have reduced cannibalistic tendencies. So that'll be a great thing when they're getting there. They're getting closer and closer. The other thing that happened in that industry is who owns the companies ultimately. So we've seen some consolidation again there under ultimate ownership of companies. It's interesting to see that Highline, Lohman, and other small ones are also now absorbed into the umbrella of Aviagen. And Aviagen also has Ross, Harbor Acres for the broilers, okay, Indian River stuff. They've also got Nicholas turkeys and BUT turkeys. So we're seeing companies like Aviagen, I can't say complete monopoly, but semi-monopolistic in the industry, having turkeys, broilers, and layers under their umbrella. Whether that's good or bad for the industry, it's hard to say at this point. So that's some major changes there. So while we're on the layer, any questions on the layer part? I hope I kind of summarized some of the changes there before we move on. Any questions about that? Send them up. I'll see if I can see them.
The only question we got so far, I don't know if you want to deal with it now
Yeah.
or later, was the role of how the role of extension has changed and adapted to the changing needs of producers and the industry. I don't know if you want to say that to the end or.
Well, I guess I can talk about that now. So my thoughts on extension. Extension has changed a little bit. There's fewer extension poultry specialists. There's fewer poultry programs at universities anymore. So that's all consolidated. Uh, when I started here at University of Connecticut in 1981, I was one of a fairly large group of extension poultry related people in New England. There was at least one regular extension specialist that was, generalist for poultry. And then many states also had a avian veterinarian in extension. They might have had ag engineer or ag economist in extension. So that slowly changed over to the point in many states there's only one extension person for poultry for the whole state or for regions. So for right now, I'm the only one in all of New England as a regular PhD poultry specialist. We have some people in the extension offices that have some poultry background, and we've set up kind of a listserv in a way, shall I say, that we have some people that we've trained in 2 different SARE projects to handle some of the small flock. And, when I say small flock, we're talking under 10,000 birds. Some of the questions they have, and especially business management stuff. So extension, I think, was very important early on to get the information out to the farmers and to the public and what was going on. So extension worked directly with a lot of industry for many, many years. I know here in Connecticut, when I came here, we would have annual meetings of over 200 people would show up for extension meetings and dinner meetings and stuff, and we talk about various subjects. And that was really good, but that's dwindled down to next to nothing right now, like I say. But I think the role of extension has changed over the years. Technology has enabled it. For example, what we're doing today, a webinar, we didn't have these 20 years ago. The internet has changed a lot. There's a lot of information out there. And when I talk to people, especially small flock people, I say, when you go on the internet, be careful what you believe. I say, if you're looking for information about animals, animal science, poultry, whatever, that you should go to university sites where they have vetted information so we know it's good. You don't go to, Mr. So-so, the chicken guy, because his grandfather had chickens and now he's the expert. That's, you never know what you're going to get. So extension has changed over the years. I think this whole e-extension is the wave of the future, with every state having budgetary issues, especially the Fed's funding extension efforts. It's a lot less than it used to be. So there's fewer of us out there doing this. I think it's going to be sad if it keeps shrinking to the point where there's no extension people in poultry, because then you'd be dictated to all by industry, and not that they're biased or anything, but hopefully extension is an unbiased source of information, and we're not beholden to anyone in particular, any one point of view. We try to educate on as many of the issues as we have knowledge or find knowledge with others. So I think what Jackie's doing here and what Mark's been doing with this whole e-extension and stuff is wonderful. It's a great idea, and I think that's the future for a lot of people. Many big commercial poultry farms still hire private consulting. Some of them have their own avian veterinarians. They have their own nutritionists, avian nutritionists. So as they get bigger and bigger, they pretty much need to have their own in-house people. But they still come to us at the universities for the new knowledge and new information. And sometimes their own people don't have that, so they come to us for that. So I hope that helped answer that question. Anything else on that?
There haven't been any other questions so far.
All right, so let me move forward then, since it's about 4 o'clock and we only got about 30 seconds more. No, we got a little bit more than that. Let's talk about the broiler industry then, and what has changed in the broiler industry. I was going to say, raise your hands if you've had a chicken lately, but I can't see y'all. So one thing you'll notice is that Some people complain that chicken doesn't taste like chicken from 50, 60 years ago. Well, it's not the same chicken, that's for sure. The modern broiler industry is again, through genetics and nutrition, has produced a bird that can hit about 5 pounds in about 38, 39 days or less. And that's, again, the public thinks, oh, we're pumping them full of hormones, we're pumping them full of drugs. Well, no, as of the veterinary feed directive, you cannot use antibiotics, okay, as growth promotants, okay, on broilers anymore. So now it's back to genetics and nutrition. You got to be careful what you can feed and what you can't. And if you do treat birds, it's only under veterinarian's care. So things have changed because of the veterinary feed directive for the broiler and meat bird industry. And I think that's probably a positive move because I can't say that the fact that we fed antibiotics as growth promotants to poultry causes antibiotic resistance in humans. I'm not sure we've ever seen a direct correlation of that, but people assume that between cattle and poultry and other use. I think human misuse of drugs, that creates a problem too, but that's another issue. So let's go back again to the broiler industry. Back before 1950, there really wasn't a major broiler industry because they didn't have a selected commercial broiler per se. What they had back then, they were using what they called the dual purpose hens, kind of the Rhode Island Red, the Barred Rocks, the White Rocks. Okay, some of those chickens, those breeds, Jersey Giants and others, they were being used as the meat birds. And they would take over 20, 25, 30 weeks, some of them, to grow to get to about 4.5 pounds, some of them 5 or 6, depending on the breeds. But it took a long time and a lot of feed to get there. Because if you go back into the 1920s and 30s, it was interesting. You'd see TV, TV movies and stuff talking about the politicians campaigning. Yes, we're going to have a car in every garage and a chicken in every pot. It's like having a chicken in every pot was a big deal. And I remember when having chicken dinner on Sunday was like a big deal because people didn't just go to the store and buy whole chickens all the time, roast them, because there weren't that many out there and they were relatively expensive, kind of like a turkey at the time. That kind of changed because A&P, if you remember A&P supermarket stores, for many years they ran what was called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. And part of that was looking at the meat type birds. And I know that Cobb and what was soon to be our Breakers and Hubbards and some of the other producers would all, put in some birds to see what's going on, but they still had a lot of colored birds. And then I think Cobb and what was going to be our Breakers out of Glastonbury, Connecticut, they had both submitted birds that had yellow skin and white feathers. That was that Cornish cross. It was the white Cornish and the white rock cross that became pretty popular, and then pretty soon that became the predominant broiler type strain bird. And if you look over the years, the meatiness, the geneticists started selecting for much more breast meat and much better feed to gain ratios. And of course, now nutritionists had to go back and start reformulating feeds based on the changing growth rates and metabolisms of these fast-growing broilers. So it went from a 20-week down to a 16-week, down to 12-week, down to 10-week, down to 8-week, and now, like I say, between 5 and 6 weeks, you can get a 5-pound or more broiler chicken. And now we have all the specialty markets. Early on, chicken was chicken. They didn't have branded chicken. And then, of course, Tyson's. They came up with, the brand name. They started that. Purdue on the East Coast, they came up with the brand name. It wasn't just chicken. It was Purdue chicken. And why was Purdue chicken better than Tyson? Because Purdue chicken, they fed marigold petals to their chickens so they had nice yellow color and made them look better, right? So there's a lot of competition going on in the marketplace at that time to get their broilers into the market. So if you looked at commercials or TV things over the years, it was interesting to see how Frank Purdue himself went out and advertised his chickens. And I remember one of his sayings was, it takes a tough man to produce a tender chicken. So some of you probably remember those. And that was pretty interesting. And he did a good job. Frank would come down to the International Poultry Expo in Atlanta every year and regale people with some of his bloopers from his commercials, and had a lot of fun down there with that. And then, of course, out in Arkansas, Tyson's and them, they were growing. They were shipping chickens up to the Chicago market, and that's how they grew. They were actually shipping chickens and realized that the money was going to be in producing and processing. So then the industry went from, a few backyard people. It went to integrated systems where the feed companies that were producing feed, they would start saying, okay, we'll contract with you to grow a certain number of birds. We'll supply the feed, and then we'll pay X dollars, pretty complex contracts, in order to get a steady supply of poultry. And then, of course, they had to have the production facility or the processing facilities. So now they became vertically integrated in that they contracted for the broiler farms where they grew them, and then they contracted, to have processing. And then, of course, they sold the feed, and then they had, some of them had storefronts of their own, or they sold to the supermarket chains under either white label or blank label for them, or under branded label as time went on. So we started seeing what we call fully integrated broiler industries, and that's pretty much what we have today, whereas ownership is monolithic to a certain extent. So there's a little bit of horizontal integration in there also, that they had trucking, they own the feed company, some of them had fuel companies and stuff, take care of that. And then to get rid of manure, interesting both for the layer industry and the broiler and turkey industry, as we produce more birds and we produce more manure, we had to find places to put it. You couldn't just put it on the land everywhere because of phosphates and other issues. So they started looking at digesters, they started looking at burning, they started looking at different processes. So I know out here, Purdue Farms, they came up with a dehydrating and pelleting type process where they made a soil amendment for manure that was good for golf course, little pellets that they would sell off for golf courses and nurseries and stuff. It was much easier, it didn't stink, and it was easier to transport. So manure is still going to be an issue in the future. Doesn't matter, broilers, turkeys, layers, what to do with it. I think some of the energy conversion systems now for methane digesters are good, but there's still an effluent that comes off of that. We got to figure out what to do. But it's interesting, the number of birds, over the years. I remember back in the 50s, we talked about millions of broilers. And, we talked about a few million laying hens. And then it grew and grew so today we have about 330 million laying hens in the flock, commercial flock, and umpteen, who knows, in the backyard flocks. And then the broiler industry, just last year, 8.75 billion with the B broilers being raised in the U.S. For some of domestic consumption and some for export and things like that. So it's pretty interesting. And the customizable market there for different size, and now with the cut-ups they have, and specialty market for tenderloins, specialty market for wings, specialty market for legs and paws. So pretty much what was used to be partially waste product has now become a demand product from the broiler industry. It's really big. And where to put all those birds, again, that's becoming another issue as people have that NIMBY, not in my backyard concept for broilers. But so that has grown. And what's interesting now is the nutrition on the broilers, what we can use. A lot of people are now looking at natural compounds to replace the antibiotics that they use to help these young broiler birds that are passing tremendous amounts of feed through their system over short periods of time, that they don't have enteritis and digestive upsets and problems. So we're looking at natural antimicrobial agents from plants. We're looking at probiotics and prebiotics. Industry, it's amazing. When there's a void, the science goes in there to try to fill that void with some new information. So I think the probiotics is a helpful thing. Some of the prebiotics are helpful things. Some of these plant-derived antimicrobials that are out there, like cinnamaldehyde or cinnamon extract. We tried to make cinnamon-flavored eggs. It didn't work, but it was good for the gut. And salmonella, still an issue. You've probably heard this on the layer side, that Rose Acres had a recall on because of this, I can't even pronounce it, salmonella something or other, Durham. I can't pronounce the name of it. It's a very rare salmonella that's out there, and Nathaniel can probably tell everybody what it is. But that was pretty odd that we saw that. We're all worried about SE. Again, a few years ago, the FDA came in and started regulating inspections and testing on any farm that has more than 3,000 laying hens, commercial. They have to have FDA inspection and testing for Salmonella enteritidis on layer farms. I'm not sure what's going on the broiler side. I know we're always looking at SE, and we're also looking at Campylobacter and other things that may be on poultry carcasses. Some of the modern inspection in the processing plants is using the UV and infrared technology. It's amazing that's out there. So the broiler industry has definitely changed, and say it's huge, it's large. The nutrition that goes into that, it's unbelievable what the nutritionists are doing, trying to save the cost of feed and yet get the birds to grow and not having any antibiotic growth promotants now. So those things are working out. Turkey side, I'm not really an expert in turkeys. We don't have that many turkeys out here in Connecticut. It's a smaller industry, but I know in the Midwest, Minnesota, North Carolina, down south, California, those are top 3 states out there. So as far as I know that are big in turkeys. And again, that industry has grown to the point where there's over 350 million turkeys being raised every year for domestic consumption as well as transition. And what's interesting in the meat industry side, both chicken meat and turkey meat, is how further processing and further processed products have come on the market. There's a lot more of those. If you look at bologna and some of the processed foods, a lot of them now are beef and turkey and pork, or beef and turkey, or turkey only. So you can get the turkey hot dogs, you can get turkey bologna, you get turkey ham. So there's a lot of neat things in the industry that's changed due to technology. The spice industry has played a huge role in that. So the demand, I think, is still there for poultry products. The demand is there for eggs. The demand is there, for the turkey and meat. Welfare issues are still going to be big issues for all 3 industries. Public perception is what's going to rule the day. We have to do a better job in agriculture, and especially in poultry production, to let the public know what we really do, why we do it, and how the birds are well cared for the most part. Otherwise, we couldn't get production that we're getting. We know that distress reduces production, simple as that. You're not going to get the egg production, you're not going to get the meat production from the broilers and turkeys if they're highly distressed. We've learned that over the years. And hopefully the poultry farmers themselves want the best for their animals, because that is their livelihood. They're going to go broke if they can't sell their product. So that's kind of my overview of the changes over the years. I think, again, environmental things, the housing has changed, it's gotten much better. Ventilation is better. We have computer controls for everything. Lighting, one of my main areas, was unbelievable. When I started here at UConn in 1980, 81, most of the commercial layer houses were still using incandescent bulbs. And then we switched over, after a few years, we introduced compact fluorescence. And the reason most farms weren't using the long tube regular fluorescent lamps is because of the flicker and because of the noise they made with the ballast and irritated birds and everything. That wasn't good. So when we first introduced compact fluorescent lamps, it took a while for the egg laying industry and the broilers to kind of latch onto that and adopt them, because they thought, well, fluorescents are fluorescents. But they realized soon that these compact fluorescents, one, were saving money, saving energy, producing good light and didn't have the flicker and the buzz and all the problems that the other long tube fluorescent lamps had. Now, in recent years, environmental concerns came up because, yes, there's a little bit of mercury in every compact and every fluorescent lamp, and therefore that's a potential environmental hazard. But fortunately, coming along with that, the LED, okay, light emitting diodes, or solid state lighting as it's called now, SSL, solid state lighting has really come into play in many, many poultry farms of all types, whether it's turkeys, broilers, or layers, are now adopting the LED technologies. And we're finding that, again, it's a cost savings over not only incandescent, but also on the compact fluorescents. And the good thing about that is you don't have to worry about the mercury and other issues. And the good thing, I think, in the future with LED lighting is the fact that LEDs can be run on direct current rather than alternating current. That means you can get direct current from a solar panel. So now we're going to see hopefully more solar panels going up on poultry buildings that have a large surface area. They can put some solar panels up and they can run all their lighting off of that. They might be able to supplement some of that electric current that goes into their fans and some of their other electric systems. But the fact that you can reduce the lighting bill is a huge savings, which means it's a cost savings on the production cost of your product, which means this can be passed on to the consumer because the consumer is always looking for less cost for their product. So that kind of burned my brain out. So I think we've covered a little everything. Jackie, I hope that's kind of what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a good overview, I think. I'm waiting to see if there's any questions from anybody. We have a few more minutes if you want to ask a question. I was getting into a thing with one of the guys from Egypt. We have somebody here from Egypt on antibiotic resistance, but I think that's a topic all on its own.
Yep.
Trying to discuss data on antibiotic resistance might be a topic for another time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Getting best wishes for your retirement.
Thank you. I appreciate it, everybody.
So while we're waiting for anybody to put in their questions, I just wanted to make a plug for next month's webinar. It's June 5th. Dr. Gregory Martin from Penn State is going to be talking about poultry behavior and how to read a flock. And then in July, he'll be talking about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and how chickens and poultry can play a role in teaching youth about those topics. And then Nathaniel, who was on here a little while ago anyway, working poultry diseases that can spread to humans. Oh, and I forgot, working with your state poultry diagnostic lab and setting up zoning regulations, working with your local authorities, and then chicken anatomy and feeding a small and backyard flock. So we have a lot of topics. If you have any additional topics that you think would be good, we could always expand to twice a month instead of once a month. We're booked through to the end of the year, but we're always looking for more topics to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I put in the link to the website, extension.org/poultry, where we have all of our resources, where we have links to our past webinars, and we have over 50 past webinars, so you'll probably find something of interest there. And our Facebook page, where we put news items or what's coming up in webinars, when the recordings are available, reminders of other webinars that are there, and whatnot. So I'm not seeing any more questions, Mike.
Sounds good.
You
All
did
right, everybody. Thanks. And I'm not going to disappear. I'll probably still be semi-active, and I hope to do a couple more webinars in the future when I can settle down a little bit, and I'll just be doing them from a different location.
You'll have to send me an email if it changes.
Yeah. No, my email will still be the Yukon one.
Oh, okay.
I get that for life. That's a perk.
Okay. Well, I'm
Everybody
glad you're
knows
going
where
to.
I am. All right, everybody, thank you, and y'all have a great day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
folks. See ya.
Thank Mark.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.